Hello again, everyone. I'm Chris Scher, and this is the Citizen Sports Weekly for Wednesday, June 16, 2021. I just had to hit a notification off my phone. That's why my finger just stuck out there. Robert Harding and Justin Ritzler are with us. COVID restrictions have been lifted in New York State, but yet here we are doing this by Zoom. That's just because Robert and Justin don't need to be in the office, and yours truly does. So, all right, guys, great to see everybody, and we'll get right to it. So, Justin Ritzel, the James Brown of sports writing last week, the hardest working man in sports writing. This guy was all over the place last week, banging out game stories, banging out features, Herculean effort, as I told our editor, Jeremy Boyer, earlier this week. And Robert Harding getting in on the action, covering a couple of games too, Wheat Sport Baseball and Auburn Girls Lacrosse. He pitched in. And guys, we'll let you discuss your recap of the sectionals, and go ahead, start away, and talk about the final week of the high school season here in Central New York.
Well, I said this on Twitter, I think Sunday or Monday, but last week, with the nature of sectionals and Section 3 and Section 4 being condensed within a week span, normally it takes place over multiple weeks at least. Sometimes with like basketball, for example, because there's so many teams that get in, you're looking at 3 weeks worth of sectional games. So last week was without a doubt the craziest week I've had in my 6 years at the Citizen. Obviously because of not only the condensed nature of sectionals, but just the unfortunate reality of our staff having to recruit Robert to come help me out, Chris helping out on sports desk and writing up roundup stuff for games that we weren't able to make it to. It was crazy, but it was fun for a lot of reasons. A lot of great games, a lot of great teams that had nice runs here last week. But it was fun to feel like you're covering games that mattered again. Not that games, in the fall and the winter and the fall 2 season didn't matter, but it was definitely a different feeling throughout this school year when the kids are they're just playing for fun and they're playing for pride, as opposed to, hey, we go out here and get the job done on any given day, and that's going to impact us for sectionals, for playoff seeding. What was unique about this year, and I think Robert can hopefully speak to this for his game that he covered on Saturday. But, normally for sectionals, you get to the semifinals or finals and all the games are played at a neutral site. They want to have a centrally located spot for games. And, I know with baseball, the championship games are often held at OCC. Lacrosse, they've been held at, SUNY Cortland, Cicero North Syracuse. This year it was different. The higher seed for each bracket was the home team for each game. So it was pretty cool in Auburn on Saturday. You have a sectional baseball final at Falcon Park going on at the same time as a girls lacrosse final at Holland Stadium. So just to kind of look back on this school year, I'm sad that high school sports is taking a break for the next couple months. It's kind of a interesting time of the year every year for the Citizen because we're kind of in a dead period. So it's always a challenge to look for stories and find stuff to cover. But after last week, I'm very much looking forward to taking a breather here, kind of kicking my feet up a little bit to the extent that we can in this business, and just kind of reflecting on what was a unprecedented year, a fun year at times, a difficult year at other times. And I think I can safely say that I'm looking forward to September and some normalcy.
Yeah. And Justin, I'll tell you this, I think for the spring sports athletes, this was a fitting way to end things because, as we both know, everybody knows that last year those kids had no season at all. There were no spring sports, at least winter sports last year. They got everything in basically through sectionals before the pandemic ended up. So there were no state playoffs last year, but at least at least section championships. At least we had local teams winning sectional championships in winter sports back in 2020. And for the spring athletes of 2020, there was no season. So for these kids, they're the only ones, because there were no fall sectionals, there were no winter sports sectionals this past year. And I'm glad the spring sports athletes had a chance to have sectionals and at least some type of resolution to their seasons where they can, yeah, they didn't get to play for state titles, and that does stink and everything, but at least they have something, some banner they can hang up on the gymnasium wall that says Section 3 champions or Section 4 champions for that matter. So, Robert.
Yeah, this was I would say a neat experience. I certainly didn't cover as many games as Brits did. I got in a couple games, but to be able to see it in this format, kind of a mad dash for sectionals, having it all in 1 week. That was interesting to me just because even though I'm not a full-time sports reporter, I can remember back, when I was in school and stuff with sports, and I, was well aware that sectionals was spread over, a period of time, usually weeks. And, I certainly know in following our sports department over the years that that's always been the case. So to see it all happen this quickly, it was quite the whirlwind. To a point that Justin mentioned about, the higher seed hosting the games and including the championship game, it did make for an interesting atmosphere at Holland Stadium, because certainly you had a big crowd there for the Auburn kids, but Fayetteville Manlius, the team that the Maroons soundly defeated on Saturday, they did travel well. They had a good contingent there, which is to be expected. They're not that far away, but it got me thinking that this wouldn't be so bad for future sectionals. I think regionals and state competitions. That I think you continue with neutral sites for those, because obviously you're moving up in importance, but it gives you something to play for during the regular season if you can secure home field during sectionals at least. I think it's something interesting to consider going forward. But I covered the Weed Sport game last week, Weed Sport baseball. That was pretty good game, and but the highlight was covering Auburn girls lacrosse winning the sectional title. That was just a fun game to watch. It was the first time I ever covered lacrosse, so it was a bit of a learning experience too. Just following the different calls and things on the field. A goal's a goal, an assist is an assist, but really learning the ins and outs of the game kind of on the fly was quite a thing. But that was a fun game to cover, and Auburn poured it on in the second half. That was something to watch. When they turn it on, it was quick. That game got out of hand pretty quickly. So that was fun to cover. But yeah, and I know with the nice thing, another part of my job here is following the web traffic. And one of the nice things is that, I remember when Justin, started covering sports, and they kind of rolled out some sports in the fall, and, there just didn't seem to be that same level of interest with a lot of the stories. That's not a knock on Justin at all, but it's just a matter of, I think that, some of the usual teams and sports and stuff that you would expect weren't playing. And so I don't think people had totally flipped the switch and said, okay, I'm ready for these kinds of sports again. But, the spring certainly showed that we're getting close to normal again, because there was a lot of interest in these stories. Just looking at last week, a lot of those stories did very well, in terms of readership. And, it's not all about clicks, but it does highlight some of the interest in these stories, whether it's the sport or a team that we're covering. And so to see that come back in that way, was really encouraging, because that showed me that, you know what, we're getting close to the end of this thing. If if this is what people are concerned about again, it's a good sign. So great week. I think Justin did an outstanding job. Covering a lot of different things. There were some hurdles too. With the weather earlier in the week. But a nice ending to the week with some sectional championships, which is always fun to cover.
Yeah. So, all right, we're going to move on to our next topic. Major League Baseball. They're cracking down on pitchers using foreign substances. They're going to be inspecting, and there's 10-game suspensions with pay, which is a joke, to be honest with you. But what do we think of MLB's efforts to crack down? Because obviously, batting averages are as low as they've ever been. And pitching, strikeouts is as high as it's ever been. So, look, MLB, we've made, God knows we've talked about before in the past in regards to how baseball is kind of messed up right now, that, the game doesn't have that ebb and flow that we like, and it's either a strikeout or a home run. So MLB is trying another effort to try to fix things. And we all know that when MLB tries to fix something, usually they break it more. So, but in regards to this, I'll say, look, they should be cracking down on these guys anyways. Look, I remember the days of Gaylord Perry, okay? And, he would always try to, the game was, where was he hiding the illegal substance on his body? Was it on his chest? Was it, under his hat, the brim of his hat? Was it in his nose or something? I mean, it was just like, what place could Gaylord Perry put some type of foreign substance to do something to the ball? And of course, Gaylord Perry was celebrated for kind of, wink, wink, playing with the rules, and got into the Hall of Fame as a 300-game winner. And I also remember Joe Niekro in the late 80s getting interrogated by the umpires on the mound, and he like put his hand in his back pockets to look, I've got nothing in my back pockets. And like a file came, he took a file and he's trying to toss it away. It's a famous video if you've ever seen it. It's gotta be on YouTube. And of course he was busted and suspended. And so I understand pitchers are always going to try to have an advantage of some type. And yes, MLB, they need to be looking at these things. If pitchers are breaking the rules, then they need to be suspended without pay. This is only fair being fair. If batters are using cork bats or some type of alterations or PEDs back in the day, is probably somebody's probably still doing it now, probably, but still, if you're breaking the rules, you should be caught and you should be punished. So, Robert, your thoughts on MLB and what they're doing here?
Look, this whole thing's a joke. The MLB. It's funny how some cheating is okay, but other cheating isn't. And it's all whenever the wind blows in a different direction and they decide to crack down on it. Look, steroids were A-OK up until the point they decided to crack down on it. These illegal substances have been in the game, even in pop culture about the game. Chris, I don't know if this is right in your wheelhouse, the movie Major League. Eddie Harris, talk about, he had substances all over his body for crying out loud. And
I was thinking about that when I was talking about Gaylord Perry, and Chelsea Ross, the brilliant actor, played that character. So that's a classic of that movie.
Yeah, it highlighted a fact about the game that continues to this day. So I just find the whole thing ridiculous because I think one of the pitchers, I think it was one of the pitchers from the White Sox, brought up this point about the Astros, that that cheating was okay because they talked to you guys and cooperated with the investigation, but they weren't punished, even though the MLB's own investigation acknowledged that this was a player-driven cheating operation, and they did nothing about it, and that's why those bums are still getting booed to this day and getting plunked to this day. That's why, because the MLB didn't do anything about it, and so the players took matters into their own hands. I get that there's concerns about spin rate. Chris, I'm not going to walk you through what that is. It's one of the things that you don't like.
No,
Um,
I'm an analytics guy, but yeah, I know what it is.
um, you know, I get there's concerns about that and some other aspects of this that give players an advantage. But, you know, look, if the MLB were consistent about this over time, I would buy this a little more. But you've let people, pitchers especially, use these substances for decades now. And that cheating was fine, especially for, as you mentioned, Chris, certain Hall of Famers that used it over time and have acknowledged that use. Uh, Steroids, not okay, not okay for the Hall of Fame. The Astros, they can keep a World Series championship. So, it just seems a little interesting to me that, this is what they decide to put their foot down about, and that they're going to, penalize people, pitchers, namely, with suspensions in this way. Look, is it cheating? Absolutely. But isn't that what baseball is all about?
Well, remember the old NASCAR accident. If you're not cheating, you're not trying. So that's kind of
If you ain't cheating, you ain't
yeah,
trying.
yeah. And I'm not condoning cheating for the record. So, Justin, your thoughts?
I'm of two minds of this. There's nothing, first off, there's nothing more frustrating, and Major League Baseball is not the first league to do this. They're not the last. There's nothing more frustrating than when a professional sports league decides midway through a season or in the middle of the playoffs or whenever, when there have already been games that have been played, to start messing with the rules. I know the NHL has been notorious for this, whether it be when they decide January rolls around and they're going to stop cracking down on the obstruction penalties. That's always a focal point in the first half of the season. Or I remember back in the playoffs many years ago when Sean Avery was making an ass of himself and he was intentionally blocking Martin Brodeur's view. And the NHL, I think rightly so in that case, stepped in and say, oh, we're going to make this rule to ban that type of nonsense. Think of the NFL a few years ago when they wanted to crack down on hits to quarterbacks. And for the first month of the season, legal tackles of the quarterback were being called for roughing the passer. And the NFL, again, I think rightly so in this case, said, we got to cool it with this. We're ruining our own product. In this case, I think MLB is screwing up the timing of this. It's well worth your time to look up a video of Tyler Glasnow, the pitcher for the Rays, who kind of broke down his issues with MLB's sudden crackdown of the use of foreign substances. As he pointed out, he's pitched 80 innings a certain way. He says he uses sunscreen mixed with rosin to get a better grip on the ball. And then suddenly within his last couple starts, he didn't use it. And while he still performed, it totally changed the way he grips the ball and the way he pitches. And now he's out with an elbow injury. And for someone that was a potential Cy Young favorite and the ace on a team that's the best in baseball right now, that's going to totally change possibly the outcome of this season. So I think that there should have been some kind of grace period, at least through the end of the year, to just say, listen, we're going to let this go for now because we don't want our star pitchers to get hurt. Shane Bieber's another guy who recently got hurt that you maybe could tie back to all this stuff. That's not good for the game. You don't want the stars to be out. There's been a lot of injuries already this baseball season, and now they're just adding to that pot with these pitcher injuries. Now, all that said, Chris loves to blame analytics for the type of baseball that's being played. I think this, again, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, that the dominant pitching is really what is the main reason why baseball is where it is, because pitchers are so good that hitters cannot string together 2, 3, 4 hits per inning. So the best way to score runs is to swing for the fences. So pitchers need to be accountable here too. You should learn how to pitch instead of relying on your grip of the baseball to throw these insanely nasty pitches every time. I think that goes a long way, all this substance, use, to why I'm not speaking out of turn here. I'm not like rewriting the book here, but why spin rates have increased, why all these breaking pitches are so nasty and so unhittable at times. These pitchers need to learn that throwing 100 miles an hour is not a right. If you can do it based on your God-given ability, then that's one thing, but it's not a right that every single guy in the majors should throw 95. So I think in the long run, MLB cracking down on this is going to have its benefits. Guys are not going to necessarily have these nasty, unhittable pitches that we've never seen before. That guys are actually going to have to learn how to pitch and mix up their speeds and not try to throw 99 every time they throw a fastball. But let's be honest, when this happens, when these pitches aren't as nasty or they're not as hard, that's going to be of a benefit. That's going to benefit the hitters. So I think we will see baseball kind of shift back to what it was 30, 40 years ago, maybe, where hitters are able to string together hits. They don't have to swing for the fences. So just to recap, I don't think what MLB is doing is wrong. I think it's overdue, and I think it can have some long-term benefits to the game. But picking this very moment to enforce it, I think is going to have some bad ramifications.
Okay, our last topic, we're going to move along to golf. The US Open starts tomorrow, and the topic is the USGA did not pair Bryson DeChambeau and Brooks Koepka in the first two rounds. And I get it. The USGA doesn't want to look like they're trying to, capitalize on this hot topic and everything. But man, what a foolish move not to do it. I mean, look, these guys, everybody saw the video on YouTube or on Twitter where, obviously Koepka was, I think it was Koepka being interviewed, right? And it was a DeChambeau. Anyways, whatever. These guys don't like each other. Let's just boil it down to that. Now, this is what bothers me about the USGA. First of all, you want these two guys to be grouped together, first of all, say, okay, that's number one. Second of all, the US Open this year is on the West Coast at Torrey Pines in California. So for the East Coast, it's going to be 3 hours behind our time. So you could have these guys go off at like 6 o'clock Eastern time. And these guys could be playing in prime time on NBC, okay? And I'm telling you, there's going to be a lot more eyeballs. They're going to watch the US Open on a Thursday or Friday night in prime time than like if they were paired off and they went off in the morning or something like that when it was the afternoon here. Or, like I said, if they have the tee times that are not that late. I don't know. I haven't seen the tee times yet, so I have no idea what time the first round's going to finish up. But I mean, this is like, we're at like the latest, we're almost at the summer equinox here where it's going to be the latest day of the year. Okay. So you could have these guys playing until about like 8:30, 9 o'clock Eastern, 8:30, 9 o'clock local time. And it's still going to be daylight. And, it would be prime time here. You could have them finish up at literally like 11 o'clock East Coast time. It'd be amazing. It'd be great for golf to have this, and the ratings would definitely would reflect this. And I'll just mention one last thing. So to show you how much this is getting play, besides us talking about it, as I was listening to a sports call-in show this morning, a national one, and a guy called in to talk about this. And the host said, this just shows you that how big this is, because when do you ever talk golf on a Wednesday like this? Usually you don't start talking about golf until the first round on Thursday. The fact this is getting so much hype now, again, it's a wasted opportunity for the USGA not to do it. And oh well. Justin, I want to wake you up here. So because I've been yawning too. So it's not just you, but what are your thoughts about this?
Well, I'm not, maybe you guys can fill me in. I'm not familiar how the draw works. Like, do they just pick random pairings to start off the tournament, or is there some kind of formula that they use, like with NASCAR, how they do the trial runs to kind of decide who has pole position? How does that work?
I don't know for sure.
Yeah, I don't think there's really any consistency to it. Sometimes I know that they have used, some sort of rankings in the past, but really it is kind of a random selection. I mean, but it's not totally random. Like, obviously, if you have like a marquee pairing, like, in Tiger's day, maybe pairing him with Phil for the first couple rounds, or even now, you put a McIlroy with a Dustin Johnson, things like that. There is some, not so randomness to it because they obviously want to play up the TV side of it. So, this really was their call on who plays with whom. So,
Yeah.
I don't mind it. I think for me personally, I would prefer a more organic pairing. Like I would love to see them both kick butt this weekend, and then Sunday, like it's those two in kind of a showdown for who's going to win the major. That's what I would be attracted to. I don't necessarily gravitate toward a forced pairing. And I don't know if it's the worst thing if we continue to let this simmer and let this build. Whether that be through this weekend and through further tournaments for the rest of the year. So that's kind of what I'm looking forward to, is the day when these two guys, because it's going to happen. They're too good of golfers to not kind of get paired up in the late stages of a tournament at some point. Hopefully it's at a major. It's going to happen. I'm not sure exactly what their history is as a pairing. I would imagine it's happened before at one of these million tournaments that they've competed in. But, I'm obviously Team Koepka, and I'll say this from, when the match was announced, Mickelson and Brady versus DeChambeau and Rogers, and Tom Brady kind of, showing the loser he is, came out with a bunch of memes trying to take digs at Rogers for football related stuff. No mention of his 3 interceptions in the NFC Championship, I might add. So Tom Brady kind of came out with his stupid memes, and Rogers came out with some goofy video, photoshopping their faces on a Star Wars scene. It was kind of weird. And then Bryson DeChambeau comes in and starts making Deflategate jokes, which is just like kind of outdated and not really that funny anymore. Like that happened 7 years ago. There's a lot more new material that you can make fun of Tom Brady with, like why he has a giant forehead or why he dyes his hair for nationally televised games. Things like that, a little more recent digs at Brady, holding up 4 fingers for third down or whatever he did. I don't know. But I just get a sense from DeChambeau, I can kind of see why he's not liked, is because he seems very corny and not as clever or smart as he thinks he is. That was evident in the interviews yesterday they did with all 4 of them trying to promote this match. Is he's kind of taking the long and winding road of making fun of Tom Brady, and it's just like, dude, you're not funny. So stop trying to be. Lefty, he's got kind of a sarcastic, dry sense of humor. Same with Rogers. I spoke my piece about Brady. I think he's a nerd too, but again, back to the original point. I look forward to the natural pairing of DeChambeau and Koepka. Maybe it'll happen this weekend, maybe not. Either way, I'll be tuning in.
Robert.
Yeah, I'm kind of torn on this because I think it would make for better golf and better TV if they're going head to head in, the third round or the final round, to go along with what Ritz was saying about the natural pairing. But look, I mean, this is the first, major after this really blew up, I think, because I think it happened after the PGA when this whole, video came out of Koepka, rolling his eyes and, talking smack about DeChambeau. To me, it's just a natural thing. Like, let's see these guys play together. And the best part is that you'd have a third person there, so it wouldn't be, you could see how they kind of play off of it and handle it as a player too. But yeah, typical USGA, they can't, they always get in their own way. My thought about this rivalry though is that it's great for golf because think about golf and yeah, you have Tiger and Phil, but was that really a rivalry? Tiger really won a lot of majors in the time that a lot more majors before Phil even won one. And then when Phil has won a lot of his majors, at least, a couple of them, came, after really Tiger hit his peak, so to speak. You know, I know that people talk about Palmer, Nicklaus, but there's not a whole lot of golf rivalries out there. And here you have two guys who, Koepka has really established himself as one of the greats in the game. With 4 majors to his name. DeChambeau has won. I think he won the Open last year. So, this makes for compelling stuff, and they're sniping at each other about different things. Obviously Koepka, DeChambeau is an easy target because obviously adding the muscle mass that he did, and looking like an oaf out there, and you combine that with the fact that he has, at least he had this reputation of being a slow player and just being a moron with different rules and things. Koepka's played into it. Here's Koepka, one of the greatest players in the world, and he's still taking time to go after this guy. It's great, and I think it's great for golf that you have this kind of rivalry between two guys that are at the top of their game. With that said, my pick for this weekend, I'm taking Brooks Koepka to win the U.S. Open at Torrey Pines. I know that a lot of people are rooting for Phil. We'll see if he even makes the cut this weekend. But I think that this course fits Koepka's game pretty well. I know that there's some people rooting for John COVID Rahm to bounce back and avenge that withdrawal that he had to make. He's a compelling choice, but it's a major. Koepka gets up for majors. I think that the way he played at the PGA was a good stepping stone. These are his 2 best tournaments, just based on his record. I think that was a good prep for him to go into Torrey Pines and win the Open. I think he'll come home with his 5th major. He's almost to that 6-pack.
Brooksy.
I like to see Phil win for obvious sentimental reasons. I mean, and obviously it's most likely, very unlikely it's going to happen. I mean, he already won 1 major this year. The chances of him winning 2 at the age of 51. By the way, his birthday, I believe, is today. So it's 51st birthday for Phil Mickelson. So, when you get in your 50s, I mean, things can change. So, but we'll see. We'll see if he can make it 2 majors in a row, which would be pretty cool. So, all right, gentlemen, wrap it up.
Well, I do have to correct one thing, Chris. A short time ago, you referred to the summer equinox. It is the summer solstice.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
I figured you were wrong,
Yeah.
so I had to double check that.
Yeah, sorry.
Equinox is autumnal and
Yes.
spring, I believe, and then you have winter
My bad.
and summer solstice. Science teachers everywhere just shake
Yeah,
their
they
heads.
would. I was not the best in science. There's no doubt about that. But thanks for setting the record straight, Robert. Justin,
And then-
as always. Yes, go ahead.
And then finally, to your point about Phil, speaking of another old guy who had a birthday, happy whatever birthday, Chris. I know that you tell people you were born in the 60s.
That is true.
Let's see the birth certificate. But
I can show you. I can definitely show you the birth certificate. I would put my driver's license up to the camera, but I don't want my information going out on the internets here. But yeah, I turned 54 yesterday. It was a fun birthday with family and everything. And yeah, 54, Robert. Okay, 54. That's what I am now. So, but anyways, it was a
The
fun.
Shira birther conspiracy.
Yeah, there we go. I was born in the 60s and I am an American citizen too. I'm quite proud of that. So, all right, folks. Thanks for joining us before we completely go off the rails here. And we'll see you next week.